The gleaming floor of Terminal 5 at Heathrow reflected the morning light as Sergeant Reuben Shaw, a Royal Guard, stepped through the automatic doors. The rush of the airport was palpable, with travelers moving in haste, but Reuben moved with an unhurried steadiness. His scarlet tunic was sharp, pressed to perfection, and the insignia on his uniform spoke of 30 years of disciplined service. Just above his breast pocket, a Victoria Cross was pinned, a quiet symbol of valor earned in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, in 2007. As he walked through the terminal, people's eyes followed him, not because of the medal, but because of the uniform. Some stared openly, others lowered their phones in respect. And a few simply gave him a wide berth, uncertain whether he was royalty or part of a reenactment. But Reuben paid no attention. He had been assigned ceremonial duty for years, serving at places like Windsor and Buckingham, and he had learned to move with a calm dignity that nothing, not even public scrutiny, could shake. If you enjoy this content, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and subscribe to my channel. Your subscription means a lot to me and gives me great motivation to make more videos. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the video. When he approached the check-in counter, the woman behind the desk smiled politely. But when her eyes met the glint of the Victoria Cross, her smile faltered. She hesitated, clearly unsettled. "Good morning, sir," she said, her tone now more cautious. "Do you have a reservation number?" "Yes," Reuben replied, handing over his printed confirmation and military ID. "Queen's Guard traveling on protocol orders to Edinburgh, first-class British Airways Flight 206, she glanced at the ID, then at the Victoria Cross, and then back at him. There was a slight pause before she excused herself, glancing toward the back office. It wasn't unusual for airline staff to confirm military travel, but her gaze lingered on the medal as if uncertain whether it was real. Moments later, a senior woman approached, Elaine Marks, the terminal supervisor. Her expression was cold, her eyes fixed firmly on the medal. "May I ask the purpose of your travel in full uniform?" she asked, her voice flat. Reuben calmly replied, "I was instructed to arrive in ceremonial dress for a memorial parade at the Palace of Holly House this evening." Elaine nodded, still eyeing the medal. "And where did you obtain that decoration?" she asked with a skeptical tone. "It was awarded for actions in Helmand Province, July 2007, Reuben responded evenly. Elaine didn't blink, but her gaze hardened. "Do you have any paperwork confirming that?" she pressed. "My ID should suffice." Reuben said, his voice calm but firm. Elaine exchanged a look with the desk agent before gently tapping her pen on the Victoria Cross. "Passengers have been known to wear unauthorized insignia. They can cause confusion or distress on board," she muttered under her breath. "This one might be a replica." Reuben stood tall, his posture never wavering. "With respect, ma'am, this isn't decorative," he said quietly. Elaine walked off without another word, and Reuben stood there, a man of quiet strength, unwilling to argue. He knew his duty wasn't just to himself, but to those who couldn't stand anymore. 10 minutes later, Elaine returned, this time with a colleague, Brendan, an off-duty airline employee dressed in a navy fleece. The moment he saw Reuben's uniform, he looked visibly uncomfortable. Elaine whispered loudly enough for Reuben to hear, "He's wearing a Victoria Cross. It looks real, but it's hard to tell these days. Some of them are replicas." "Could have bought it online," Brendan frowned. "Shouldn't we just verify it?" Elaine snapped, her voice sharp. "I don't want any drama in the boarding lounge." Reuben, who had not moved an inch, spoke calmly. "You're welcome to verify it with the Ministry of Defense or the Royal Household. Either would be happy to confirm." Elaine didn't respond and instead gestured for Reuben to step aside. "We'll continue check-in once we sort this out," she said curtly. Reuben complied without protest, quietly placing his leather carry case down. The weight of the situation was heavier than any uniform could be, but still, he stood taller, not for himself, but for the ones who couldn't. A few minutes later, another junior staff member returned with Reuben's boarding pass in hand. But this one wasn't the first-class ticket he had originally been given. "Sir," the agent said gently, avoiding his gaze. "You've been reassigned. Seat 37B, economy." Reuben blinked in confusion. "On what grounds?" the agent faltered. "We've been told there is a concern about onboard disturbance. Your uniform and metal could cause confusion in the cabin." Reuben didn't argue. He simply nodded, accepting the change. He had been in far worse situations, faced tighter spaces than this. He knew this wasn't hardship, it was just an error in protocol. Elaine reappeared a moment later, watching the exchange with satisfaction. "Is that metal really necessary?" she asked sharply. "We've had complaints in the past, think it might intimidate some passengers." Reuben's reply was steady, measured. "That's not a decoration, ma'am. That's a name." Elaine raised an eyebrow. A name for the ones who didn't come home." She crossed her arms, dismissing his words. "Well, this is a commercial airline, not the Senate. If you want to play dress up, do it somewhere else." Several passengers nearby turned to look. Reuben stood motionless, offering nothing but a quiet dignity. "I'm under royal orders," he said. "I was instructed to report in uniform for the ceremony in Edinburgh." Elaine shrugged dismissively. "Well, then I suggest you get used to economy," she said coldly. "We're not running a parade here." Reuben nodded slowly, his face impassive. "No, I don't suppose you are." Elaine walked off, clearly pleased with herself, while Brendan hesitated, glancing at Reuben with a hint of regret before following her. As Reuben gathered his things, a man in a business suit stepped forward from the nearby queue. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "I saw that, and I just want to say thank you for your service." Reuben gave a small, respectful nod. "It's appreciated." The businessman glanced at the Victoria Cross. "That's the VC, isn't it?" Reuben nodded again. "It is. Not many people get to see it up close." The businessman offered his hand, and Reuben shook it firmly before turning to head to gate 12C, the silence of the moment following him like a shadow. As Reuben made his way down the aisle toward his new seat in economy, his boots clicking lightly on the aircraft's floor, the quiet changed. Some passengers glanced up from their devices, curiosity in their eyes. Reuben reached row 37, his seat tucked between a young woman wearing earbuds and a heavier-set man occupying the aisle seat, elbows flared. "Excuse me," Reuben said quietly to the woman. She moved aside with a surprised but polite smile. The man didn't budge until Reuben gently squeezed by. The weight of his uniform felt heavier in the tight space, and the overhead bins were full, but Reuben said nothing, just adjusted himself into the seat. A flight attendant rushed to assist, flustered. "Sir, I'm sorry about this," she said, lowering her voice. "We had a note from the front desk, but I didn't realize." "I'm sorry. It shouldn't have happened this way." Reuben smiled faintly. "It's all right. Just help me secure the case." She nodded, but her eyes lingered on the Victoria Cross. She wanted to say something, but professionalism won over. And she quickly disappeared down the aisle. The murmurs began to ripple through the surrounding seats. "Is that real?" someone whispered. "Looks like a soldier or something." A few rows back, an older man, dressed in a dark green tweed jacket, leaned forward slightly. "Excuse me, Sergeant," he said in a low voice. "That VC? Afghanistan?" "Yes, sir," Reuben replied, inclining his head. The man's eyes lit up. "Royal Welch Fusiliers, myself. Korea, 52. I recognize that ribbon anywhere." Reuben smiled faintly. "It's an honor." "No, son," the old man said, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. "That honor's all yours." He raised a shaky hand in salute, not sharp but full of respect. Reuben returned it with a subtle nod. The cabin fell into a deeper quiet. The weight of the Victoria Cross wasn't in the display, it was in the memory it carried, the reverence it inspired. as the plane continued its boarding process, the sound of polished leather echoed through the aisle. Everyone's eyes were drawn to the figure approaching the gate. It was King Charles, moving deliberately and with quiet authority, dressed in a sharp charcoal gray suit. No one noticed the faint insignia of the Order of the Garter on his tie at first, but the cabin crew immediately straightened when they saw him. Passengers stopped mid-conversation, phones lowered, and a hushed silence spread across the cabin like a slow wave. No announcement was made, but the atmosphere shifted the moment he stepped on board. The king moved through the aisle with ease, acknowledging the senior steward with a brief nod. Conversations ceased as he walked past. When he reached row 37, he stopped next to Reuben's seat. Reuben, still sitting calmly in his cramped space, turned slowly. Their eyes met for only a moment. There was no need for words. Without any fanfare, Reuben rose to his feet with the same quiet dignity that had defined his every move throughout the day. He straightened his back and brought his heels together with a crisp, respectful salute. The few passengers who noticed froze, the silence in the cabin almost tangible. One young child whispered to her mother, "Mommy, is that who I think it is?" The king didn't smile, but he returned the salute just as precisely and quietly. A soft understanding passed between them, an acknowledgement of shared experience that transcended words. It was a gesture not of formality, but of mutual respect, both men bound by the weight of duty and sacrifice. Reuben resumed sitting, and the king turned to the flight attendant. A woman who appeared suddenly pale in the face of this silent exchange. "Sir," she stammered, her voice tight with nervousness, "you were seated in 37B, but we were not informed of the change until now." "You've been reassigned." Yes, thank you," the king interrupted gently. "Please, inform the captain. I'll be remaining on board." There was no further explanation needed. The gravity of the moment hung in the air. As Elaine, still standing near the galley, watched the interaction with wide eyes, it became clear to everyone watching, Reuben's quiet dignity had earned him not only the respect of those around him but the unspoken recognition of royalty itself. The flight attendant quickly rushed off, and within moments, the captain was informed. Reuben was escorted to the front of the plane, but not by any ordinary means. He was offered a seat in the front row, first class, with no fanfare or acknowledgement of the discomfort he had endured just moments before. As Reuben passed Elaine, standing near the front, she stood frozen, unable to meet his gaze. She could only stare at her shoes, her expression unreadable. Reuben moved forward without a word, his presence filling the space with an understanding that needed no explanation. He placed his bag neatly beneath the window and took his seat, just as King Charles settled into the one beside him. The contrast was unmistakable, but neither man acknowledged the tension in the air. There was no need. The quiet exchange between the two was more powerful than any public display could have been. In the few moments of silence that followed, the flight attendant returned to offer tea. She placed a tray between them, but neither of the men touched it immediately. They sat in quiet reflection, each lost in their own thoughts. "You know," the king said quietly after a moment. "There's something about long flights that forces reflection. You can't go anywhere, so your thoughts do." Reuben glanced over. "That's true, sir," he agreed. "Same thing happens on long watches, especially at night. We used to rotate 4-hour watches in Helmont. Once everything went quiet, it was just you, your breath, and 100 shadows. Enough to make you remember things, or forget the wrong ones." Charles nodded thoughtfully. "And you carried that into the guard." "It's all the same posture, sir," Reuben replied. "Stillness, eyes forward. You're not there to talk. But you are there to be seen. That's the point." The king took a sip of tea. "Tell me if it's not an imposition," he began after a pause. But about the medal, Reuben didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was steady but distant. "Convoy hit an IED. Dust, fire, noise, everything blurred. One of our trucks flipped. The gunner was trapped underneath. I crawled in. We were taking small arms fire from a ridge. No cover. Just smoke and shouting. I dragged him out. Lost a bit of my hearing that day. Some didn't make it. Charles remained still, listening intently. Reuben continued, his words careful but controlled. I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just moved when I should have stayed still. The men next to me didn't have that option either. The king leaned forward slightly. You think people don't understand what it means? He asked softly. Reuben looked down at his medal, then out the window. I think it doesn't fit in airports, he said quietly. The silence between them stretched, not uncomfortable, but weighted. The king broke it after a moment. My father once said something about medals, Charles remarked. He said they weren't symbols of bravery. They're receipts for pain that was paid on credit. Reuben blinked, impressed. Smart man, he said quietly. Charles allowed a faint smile. He was. He also said, sometimes people will think you're proud of a medal. You're not. You're honoring the weight of it, Reuben nodded. That's exactly it. Charles glanced at him, a thoughtful look in his eyes. You know, Sergeant, in all my years, I've met more men with medals than I can count. But only a few understood the burden of being seen in one. Fewer still had the dignity to wear it in silence. Reuben didn't respond. He didn't need to. It was understood. The aircraft hummed softly as it ascended, and the two men sat side by side, bound not just by their respective roles, but by the shared understanding of what it meant to bear witness to history without the need for applause. Reuben remained quiet, his gaze fixed ahead. He had been through far worse than a cramped seat or a condescending airline supervisor. But there was something about the weight of this moment, the quiet recognition that unfolded when King Charles had moved to make space for him. Elaine's earlier words still stung, but they weren't what lingered. The true weight of the moment, the heavy silence between these two men, spoke volumes. It wasn't about the medal. It was about what it represented, the lives lost, the bonds forged in the quiet, and the commitment to duty that didn't need any outward validation. The king spoke again, this time more softly. You remind people what loyalty looks like, Sergeant Shaw. Without ever opening your mouth, Reuben glanced at him, a faint smile touching his lips. Not everyone sees it that way, he murmured. Charles smiled slightly. They don't need to. The rest of the flight passed without incident, with the two men sitting in comfortable silence. For them, there were no speeches, no ceremonies. Just two men, in their respective uniforms, quietly carrying the weight of history. Of duty, and of service. As the plane flew through the clouds, the only sound in the cabin was the hum of the engines, a soft reminder that sometimes, silence speaks louder than words ever could. As the flight continued, the quiet in the cabin remained unbroken, save for the soft mechanical hum of the aircraft. The curtains that separated the first-class section from the rest of the cabin remained drawn, isolating the two men in their own space. Reuben, now settled into his new seat, placed his leather travel bag neatly beneath the window and adjusted his ceremonial tunic. There was no rush, no need to move quickly. His posture, as always, was deliberate and composed. Despite the calm in the cabin, a subtle undercurrent of tension still lingered. Passengers who had observed the silent exchange between Reuben and King Charles seemed to be reflecting on it in their own ways. The weight of the moment had affected them, even if only for a brief instant. A few passengers turned their eyes away, as if the reverence between the two men had made them feel as though they were intruding. For Reuben, it wasn't about the recognition, it never had been. The king's presence wasn't what had moved him, nor was it the seat change. It was the quiet understanding that had passed between them. The king had moved for him, not out of duty, but out of respect. And in that act, Reuben felt a deep, resonating silence. King Charles shifted slightly in his seat and took another sip of tea, his gaze resting outside the window, though his thoughts seemed far from the clouds below. After a long moment, he turned toward Reuben, his voice low but steady. You know, Sergeant, I often think about the weight that comes with silence. Not the silence of avoidance or fear, but the silence of reflection. Reuben nodded slowly, his eyes still forward. Silence is often the most honest form of reflection, sir. It's where you can hear everything and nothing at once. The king regarded him thoughtfully. Indeed. In the quiet, you remember. And sometimes, it's that remembering that holds the most weight. Reuben's gaze drifted out of the window as the plane glided through the sky. The man next to him, a king, a monarch with a legacy of leadership and sacrifice, understood the weight of history, of duty, and of remembering those who had come before. And for a brief moment, it wasn't about their titles. It was about two men, each carrying the burden of memory in their own way. If you enjoy this content, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and subscribe to my channel. Your subscription means a lot to me and gives me great motivation to make more videos. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the video. Back in the main cabin, the tension from the earlier exchange was still palpable. A few passengers whispered quietly among themselves, their curiosity piqued by the sudden change in the seating arrangement. Reuben had not sought out the attention, in fact, he preferred the quiet of his seat. But the world had shifted ever so slightly around him, and now, even in the relative privacy of first class, his presence had caused a ripple. Meanwhile, Elaine Marks stood near the front of the cabin, her arms crossed as she observed the scene from a distance. She hadn't yet fully grasped the depth of what had just unfolded. To her, it was just another protocol gone awry, another instance where an individual in a uniform had to be reined in. But something in the atmosphere of the cabin had changed, and she felt it. The silent nods, the respectful gaze of the elderly man in the aisle, and most notably, the unexpected gesture from King Charles had all shifted the air around her. She felt a sudden unease that she couldn't shake. It wasn't until later, when she made her way back to the galley to check on some minor issues, that she caught a glimpse of Reuben and the king in their quiet exchange. She noticed the way the air around them had settled into a stillness, and her eyes flitted between them with a new sense of awareness. It wasn't the spectacle of royalty that had commanded attention, it was the simple, dignified way Reuben carried himself. Elaine, in her defensiveness, had failed to see what was right before her. The medal on Reuben's chest wasn't a symbol of pageantry. It wasn't an act. It wasn't for show. It had weight, an unimaginable weight borne not by Reuben alone, but by all those who had fought beside him and lost their lives. It was a name, not for attention, but for remembrance. And yet, she had been so quick to dismiss it. As she stood in the galley, the realization began to sink in. She had misjudged the situation, misunderstood the man before her. She had failed to see the depth of the quiet loyalty that was woven into the fabric of his uniform, into the very presence he exuded. The truth of it felt uncomfortable now. She had judged a book by its cover, and it had cost her. As the flight neared its destination, the quiet conversation between Reuben and King Charles continued, though the words had slowed. There was no need to fill the silence with empty chatter. In the shared understanding between them, there was no hurry. The hours passed in a comfortable silence as the plane soared toward Edinburgh. Reuben's thoughts drifted back to the earlier days of his service, to the men who had stood with him, and to the men who had never made it home. It was for them that he wore the Victoria Cross, not for the recognition, not for the applause, but to keep their memories alive. King Charles seemed to sense the shift in Reuben's thoughts. "You know, Sergeant," he began, his voice quieter now, "not many people understand the weight of a medal like that. Most of the time, they see the decoration, but they don't see what it means, the lives lost, the sacrifices made." Reuben nodded, his eyes fixed out the window. "Some medals are earned in battle. Others are earned in silence." The king smiled faintly. His voice soft. "That's very true. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is wear that silence with dignity. People will misunderstand it, but that's their burden, not yours." Reuben met his gaze, a brief but meaningful look passing between them. I've learned that silence speaks louder than any words could. As the plane descended, the hum of the engines was the only sound that filled the cabin. Reuben felt a quiet peace settle over him. He had done his duty, he had remembered the ones who had gone. The world around him might not always understand, but that was fine. He didn't wear his medal for them. He wore it for the silent ones who would never walk through an airport or sit in first class, and in that moment, sitting beside the king, Reuben knew that his silent strength had been seen, not just by royalty, but by the people who mattered most, the ones who understood what true loyalty meant. The plane touched down softly on the runway, and the soft hum of the engine slowly began to fade as the aircraft slowed to a halt. For a brief moment, Reuben sat quietly in his seat, the weight of the journey still lingering. Though the flight was over, the atmosphere in the cabin hadn't returned to its usual noise. There was something different about the way the passengers now looked at him, less out of curiosity and more with respect. As the seatbelt sign flickered off, the flight attendants began their routine procedures, preparing for disembarkation. King Charles shifted in his seat, looking over at Reuben with a faint smile. There was no need for words, the shared silence had already spoken volumes. You know, Sergeant, the king said softly, his voice steady but with a hint of warmth, I've met many men with medals, but few with the grace to wear them quietly. Most people are content to wear them to be seen. But you wear yours for a different reason. Reuben's gaze remained forward, but his voice was steady. I wear it for the ones who didn't make it home, sir. It's for them, not for me. Charles gave a small nod. His eyes thoughtful. It's an honor to carry the memories of others like that. I think many people forget what it means to stand still in the face of the world's noise. You remind them with your silence. Reuben's only reply was a nod of agreement. He had never worn the medal for himself, never for the applause or recognition. It was a reminder of his brothers in arms, those who had given everything. For them, he would carry it in silence, without ceremony or fanfare. Elaine Marks had remained near the front of the cabin as the flight neared its end, her mind still preoccupied with what had transpired earlier. As the plane began its descent, she tried to focus on her duties, but the earlier events kept playing through her mind. Her words to Reuben, the doubts she had voiced about the authenticity of his medal, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been deeply wrong about how she treated him. She had assumed that someone like him, a man in uniform, would be accustomed to attention. She had dismissed his presence in the way so many people dismissed the unfamiliar. But now, seeing the quiet dignity that Reuben had carried with him throughout the flight, she couldn't help but reflect on the respect he had commanded, not by force, but by mere presence. Her thoughts were interrupted as she walked past the first-class section to check on the crew's preparations. She noticed, for the first time, how Reuben and the king were sitting. Their exchange had been brief, but the understanding between them was palpable, like a silent bond of respect that spoke louder than any words. Elaine had missed it. She had been too quick to judge, too quick to belittle a man she now understood she knew little about. She had dismissed his uniform, his medal, as a prop, something for show. But she now saw it wasn't just for the king. It was a testament to the quiet sacrifices made by men like Reuben. Men who had never sought applause but had, instead, carried the weight of duty in silence. As she walked back toward the galley, she couldn't help but wonder if she had learned something she wasn't quite ready for. The respect Reuben had earned wasn't one that could be taken lightly. And now, standing in the presence of the kind of man she had underestimated, she felt her own understanding of respect beginning to shift. The plane had landed, and as passengers began to file out of their seats, the brief but powerful exchange between Reuben and King Charles began to fade into memory for most. Yet, for those who had witnessed it, something had changed. Even without words, the weight of the moment had made an indelible mark on the cabin. As Reuben stood to gather his belongings, he remained composed and unfazed, as he always did. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic exits, only quiet dignity. As the passengers in the aisle began to stand, a few of them turned to look at him. Some nodded respectfully, others simply lowered their eyes, acknowledging the gravity of the man before them, King Charles. For his part, had already begun moving towards the exit, his presence as understated as ever. As he passed the crew and staff, a few paused to acknowledge him, but he remained focused, walking with the ease of a man who had seen more than his fair share of public attention. Elaine watched them both, standing at the back of the cabin, her thoughts churning. As she watched the two men exit, she couldn't help but feel the sting of her earlier judgments. The king's quiet understanding of Reuben's service had spoken louder than anything she could have said, and now, in hindsight, she understood that her earlier actions had been tainted by a lack of awareness, in her rush to follow protocol. She had failed to recognize the true nature of the medal Reuben wore. It wasn't a symbol of pride, it was a tribute to the lives lost, a reminder of the quiet sacrifices made in service. And in that silence, Reuben had taught her something she wasn't sure she would ever fully articulate. Sometimes, the most powerful way to honor someone isn't by raising your voice in praise, but by standing in silence and remembering. Reuben Shaw had not been asking for recognition, but in his dignified silence, he had earned something far greater than applause. He had earned respect. And that was something not everyone understood. As Elaine stood there, she realized that the true measure of a person's service wasn't in their display, but in how they carried their honor through the world. And Reuben Shaw had carried his honor with a dignity that had no need for explanation or recognition. It was a quiet lesson in strength, and one that Elaine would not soon forget. As the passengers exited the plane, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere at the gate. The quiet tension that had hung in the air since the initial encounter between Reuben and Elaine seemed to have dissipated. But something unspoken lingered. People who had witnessed the exchange, whether they were aware of the full gravity of the situation or not, had felt the weight of it. The hushed reverence, the mutual respect between Reuben and the king, had left an impression on many, even those who hadn't fully understood what had transpired. Elaine Marks stood by the gate, watching the passengers leave, her posture still defensive, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her mind was racing, replaying the entire event over and over. She had thought she was simply following procedure, but now she understood how wrong she had been. The power dynamics that had played out in the terminal weren't about authority or protocol. They were about something far more significant: honor, respect, and the weight of history. Back at the airline's headquarters, an internal review was already underway. Elaine's actions were being scrutinized by HR, and the formal complaints that had been filed, though anonymous, had clearly caught the attention of higher-ups. Elaine was summoned for a meeting with a senior administrator and a corporate representative. When she walked into the room, she immediately sensed the tension. The atmosphere was starkly different from the casual, somewhat indifferent tone of her usual workplace meetings. She sat down, her hands tense on the armrests, unsure of what was about to unfold. "We're not here to punish you, Elaine," the senior administrator said, her tone measured but firm. "But we've received a formal complaint about your treatment of a passenger. Specifically, one Sergeant Reuben Shaw. We've reviewed CCTV footage, statements from passengers and staff, and there's a clear concern about your tone and actions." Elaine stiffened. "I was just following procedure. I questioned the authenticity of his medal because it wasn't immediately clear to me. It's not uncommon for passengers to wear replica insignia." The corporate representative, a man in a suit, glanced at her, his expression cold. "It's one thing to follow procedure, Elaine, and another to mock a man who has earned a Victoria Cross. You made assumptions about his medal without verifying it, and in doing so, you publicly degraded a man who had served his country. You also made him uncomfortable by downgrading his seat, which was inappropriate." Elaine's face flushed with embarrassment as the weight of her actions finally hit her. She had misunderstood Reuben's presence, had underestimated the significance of his uniform, and had dismissed his quiet dignity. In doing so, she had failed to treat a hero with the respect he deserved. while Elaine faced the repercussions of her actions, Reuben Shaw continued his life, as quietly and steadily as always. He was a man of few words, but the silence he carried was powerful. His service in the military had shaped him into someone who didn't seek the limelight, didn't want the world to acknowledge his bravery, and certainly didn't wear his Victoria Cross for attention. For Reuben, the medal wasn't a symbol of personal glory. It was a reminder of the men who hadn't made it back, the ones who had given their lives in service. It was a tribute to those who couldn't wear it themselves. He wore it not to be seen but to remember. After the flight, as he moved through the terminal in Edinburgh, Reuben didn't walk with the sense of pride that others might associate with such an award. Instead, he walked with the calm of someone who had long since learned that true strength lies in quiet service, not loud declarations. He knew that the world wouldn't always understand the reasons behind his silence, but he was fine with that. His actions spoke louder than anything he could say. As he passed through the arrivals hall, a woman stopped him and looked at him curiously. Her eyes fell on the Victoria Cross, and she paused. "Excuse me, are you?" Reuben gave a small nod, acknowledging her recognition. "Just doing my duty," he said simply, and then moved on. No press release. No fanfare. Just a man in civilian clothes carrying the weight of memory, moving quietly through the world, never seeking recognition but always honoring those who couldn't walk beside him. The days following the flight passed without any major event. The world moved on, and so did Reuben Shaw. He received an apology from the airline, delivered in an unmarked envelope. The letter was formal, with no names mentioned, and no references to the royal connection that had made Reuben's treatment a matter of internal review. It was simply a letter of apology for the poor treatment he had received. Reuben didn't feel the need to respond. He had long ago learned that the weight of a medal is not in the medal or ribbon but in the meaning behind it. The apology was not necessary for him. What mattered was the quiet recognition of his service by those who truly understood it. In the weeks that followed, the airline issued an internal policy update. The memo, placed in the staff newsletter, was short and to the point. Effective immediately, staff are reminded to treat all service uniforms with full professional courtesy. For clarity, official military decorations, including the Victoria Cross, are to be acknowledged as such unless otherwise proven. There was no mention of Reuben's name, no mention of King Charles, no mention of the incident at all. It was simply a correction, a quiet adjustment made in the background. But for those who had witnessed what had happened, the meaning was clear. There had been a mistake, and it had been quietly corrected. Reuben, for his part, carried on without comment. He didn't need an apology. He didn't need public recognition. His service, his sacrifice, and his duty had already been etched in time. The silence that had followed him through the airport, the silence that had characterized his entire life, was the true testament to his strength. As for Elaine, the lesson she had learned stayed with her. She had misjudged Reuben, had failed to recognize the value of quiet dignity. And though she would never publicly admit it, she understood now that true strength is not in the noise one makes, but in the stillness one maintains in the face of adversity. Reuben's actions had shown her that, sometimes, the most powerful thing a person can do is stand tall in silence, bearing the weight of history and memory without ever needing to speak. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit like and share it. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring videos. Thanks again and see you in the next one.